5 years ago, Kim and Davis and I moved into our house that we live in Rancho Lorena. And it was so fun, new house, just kind of a blank canvas. And we went about making it our own. We were you know how you are, so excited to get started. So we decided, we painted the fence and we installed landscaping everywhere. Some of you will remember I got myself in trouble with the HOA by putting up a split rail fence around the field there next to our house, and that led to me becoming the HOA president for 2 years, which gladly I'm not anymore. But anyway, so we did all of that work. I mean, it was a ton of work, but it was a new place. We're excited to do all that construction project. Now, what I've realized over the last 5 years is that I enjoy the construction part more than the maintenance part. I don't know if that resonates with anybody, but you build all this stuff and then you have to actually maintain it. You have to keep up with it, and I have not probably kept up with it like I should. I've been a little busy, but what happens if you do construction but you don't do maintenance is, of course, then you have to do restoration. And now it's 5 years later, which in part means that 5 years ago I was closer to 40 and now I'm closer to 50. And so my body is a little bit older and a little bit more tired. But as we've come into the spring and towards summer, it was just time. 5 years, it's time for maintenance. It's time for a whole new work of restoration in a lot of the projects that we installed 5 years ago. And so we've been steadily working on it, but I took a few days off this week to really put myself all the way into it. And so I spent Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday doing all of this work. That included moving about 3,500 pounds of concrete, about 3,000 pounds of mulch, applying 25 gallons of paint across fences and decks and all kinds of other things. And so if I drop something, I'm going to need somebody to come pick it up for me. That's number one. But number two, what I've learned is that restoration, that work of restoration, it's painful. You really have to do some deep work in order for restoration to take place. Like, for instance, on our back deck, which it was in need of a new coat of stain, but just a new coat wasn't going to do it. It had been blistered by the sun through the years, and so I had to strip off the old and power wash and sand and do all of this work. And I finally realized you never finish preparation. You just stop. Like, at some point, it's just, that's as good as it's going to be. Replace old boards, add some new screws. But you really have to strip it down. It took a lot of time and energy before we were then able and ready to apply the new coating on top. That work of restoration can be challenging, the more so if you don't do any maintenance from the time you install it to the time you work to restore it. I was thinking about that with this old body too, because now it feels like, because I haven't done a lot of maintenance in the gym, that this body needs some restoration too. Some restoration from the Lord, perhaps. And maybe even the soul that we carry around inside of us, we find a similar pattern at work. That perhaps there's parts of us deep inside that need a little bit of restoration. That maybe from the time God breathed the breath of life into us, that He first created us, we haven't done all the kind of soul care and soul maintenance that perhaps we should have been doing, and we find ourselves blistered by the world, beat down by the wind and by the sun and by the impact of the world around us. We're just kind of worn down and worn out. You can see what was there once, but it's lost some of its integrity and strength. And we need a little bit of work of restoration. As we're continuing along in this series of examining how Jesus moves with His grace in His encounters with people, we come to a series of encounters now where Jesus applies His grace in people's lives in ways that are restorative. In Mark's gospel in particular, Jesus' encounters with people is more than just a work of healing. It's more than a work of teaching. It is a work of total restoration. It doesn't just address one part of a person's life, but it sees the whole person for who they are and all they were created to be. The grace that Jesus applies rebuilds them from the ground up, addresses not only the state of their bodies, but also of their emotional and spiritual selves. It's a work of total restoration in ways that are small and in ways that are large. Jesus leaves no part of those he encounters unchanged. We're going to focus in Mark chapter 1, verses 40 and following. But before we get there, we see Jesus already in this mindset and work of restoration. Jesus gets up and he goes off and he prays. He goes into his friend Peter's house where Peter's mother-in-law is sick and in her room. And Jesus walks right into her bedroom. He heals her. And the story focuses then on she gets up and she goes in the kitchen. She prepares a meal and she feeds Jesus and all of his companions, which may seem like just the postscript to this narrative, but in reality, it is the major point of what Jesus has done. There's nothing to indicate in the text that her sickness was severe or life-threatening in any way. It wasn't like Peter said, "Quickly, Jesus, come to my house. My mother-in-law is sick." It's just that she was going through something and she was in bed. But the reality is, sick in bed kept her from being in community with Jesus and his disciples. It kept her from fulfilling her role of hospitality and welcome. In other words, she had been displaced from her place of purpose and dignity and service. And so Jesus walks into the house and he walks right into her room. He heals her, and in healing her physical self, he restores her ability to come out, to cook, to set the table, to sit, to listen, to engage with Peter, with Jesus, and with all those who had gathered around him on that day. It seems like a small thing, except that it isn't at all, really, if you've ever found yourself isolated or outside of your ability to engage in the community that you long to be a part of. Most of us at this point have gone through like the flu or COVID or something where we find ourselves isolated in a room, and if you're like me, your wife just kind of opens the door and throws food in. I told her I was going to have to just tell on her, and this is a good week because she's taking Davis to my sister's house, so she's not here. Don't tell. But my wife and my son each got themselves these Venus flytrap plants. They're fascinated with them. They walk around collecting bugs and feeding these plants. They require distilled water. You can't just water them. Now you should know, in our house, I take care of all the living plants. Mine's the thumb that is green. I don't do anything with these things. I would never have bought them because they are way too fussy. But my wife literally hand feeds them bugs, puts distilled water in. She carries them outside, lets them sit in the sun, talks to them, carries them back inside. She just tends to all of their needs. When I have the flu, I am not kidding. She just opens the door and throws food in at me. If I ate flies, I would get a better caring for. I don't know what it is about these Venus flytraps, but she says it's because I won't allow us to have any more pets in the house. So somehow these count, I don't know. That has nothing to do with anything. I just am really disturbed at her care of these flytraps compared to. Anyway, I digress, as they say. I don't even know where I was anymore now. I'm just like so upset about these flytraps, the care they get. Here's what I want to say. is when you're isolated, you're alone, and your family's gathering in that other room, you know what it feels like to not be able to. It seems simple, but it's huge. And for Peter's mother-in-law, there she was. She had the rabbi in her house. She had the healer. She had the one that the whole community was talking about there in her house. And it would be her normal responsibility. It would be her normal honor to welcome him into her home, to have his blessing rest upon her and on her household as she tended to the people that she loved and cared for, as she interacted in community. But her sickness was keeping her from being able to do that which she loved. Here it is, carrying the fly traps in and out. And so Jesus went and healed her, and he restored her. He restored her. It seems simple, but doesn't that make you love Jesus all the more? That he sees all of our need, great and small, and addresses them with love and compassion, and by his grace restored her body, which restored her into her place of service and community. As the passage goes on, moves forward, we come to another encounter with someone who is sick and suffering, but whose restoration is all the more significant because of his ailment. Mark chapter 1, verse 40 and following. Mark chapter 1, verse 40 and following. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus was indignant. He reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said, "be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him, and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See that you don't tell this to anyone, but go show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and he began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet the people still came to him from everywhere. A man with leprosy comes to Jesus. A bold move, friend. A bold move from this man who is experiencing the devastating effects of leprosy. For those in Jesus' day who were lepers, who were afflicted with a skin disease, they were isolated from the community. They were separated from the rest of the people. They were required to walk from one side of town to the other for some reason, they had to walk through town where anyone might be, shouting, "Unclean! Unclean! Unclean," lest someone accidentally encounter them, accidentally touch them, accidentally bump into them. Talk about isolated from community. Talk about severed from your family, from your friends, from the dignity of work and contribution to the world around you. Talk about humiliating, devastating. This diagnosis pushed you to the very edges and fringes of society where you couldn't be seen or heard. You certainly couldn't participate even in spiritual renewal because you weren't allowed in the temple. So this man with leprosy boldly comes to Jesus, to a rabbi, to a teacher, to a man of some renown, to a guy who always has great crowds around him. And he comes and he falls at his knees and he says, "If you're willing, you can make me clean." The man has faith that Jesus can do something for him that will change his life forever. He has faith that if Jesus only has a willingness, then he could experience healing, that his life could be transformed, that he would experience grace in a way that would make it so that his life was never the same again. And he comes and he falls on his knees and he begs Jesus. And the text says Jesus was indignant. Other manuscripts say he was filled with compassion. I think it's something mixed up in there. Jesus was filled with compassion for the man, but indignant with the brokenness of mankind. Can you sense that from Jesus in his holy mission of restoration on the earth? He's filled with compassion for the sons of Adam and the daughters of Eve who have been broken from their created place. And he's indignant at the world and sin that has just marred his Father's perfect creation so sickeningly. But he's filled with compassion for the person in front of him. And he just pours out his grace. I'm willing, he says. I'm willing, Jesus. Of course Jesus is willing. It's why he's come, to pour his grace into the broken hearts of all he encounters. If you're willing, yes, I'm willing. I'm willing. It says Jesus reached out his hand, and pay close attention, touched the man. I don't know how long it had been since the man had experienced another human touch. But I can tell you this, it was before the first lesion appeared on his skins. Years? More? I don't know when the last time was somebody reached out and touched him. But I know it was sometime before he came down with the leprosy, because you don't touch a leper. That's why they shout unclean. Not only do you not touch them, you just move out so you're not sharing air with them. And this giver of grace, his first impulse is to reach out and to touch. To reach out and to touch, to connect. Jesus wasn't afraid of his leprosy, wasn't afraid of catching whatever this guy had. He wanted to give this man what he had: grace, restoration. So it says Jesus reached out and he said, I'm willing, let me touch you, let me hold you, and you are clean. And immediately the man's skin was cleaned and cleared. Immediately he was healed. It may be a little confusing why Jesus said, don't tell anybody what's happened, but the answer is right here in Mark's gospel. He tells it to us. Jesus wanted to be sure that everyone would have access to his teaching about his mission and why he would come. Why? Because Jesus wants everyone to be able to have access to his grace. And so he said, look, if you go and you tell everybody, it's going to become so hard for me to move around. I won't even be able to go into a town and tell them why I've come, which is to save them from their sins and to restore that which sin has broken. And of course, that's exactly what happens. We're told there in a little postscript. But you can hardly slight the man. If I had spent the last years, decade, whatever, walking through town going unclean, unclean, I'd be running from person to person. Clean, hug, clean, hug, clean, hug. Look at this. And every one of them. How did that happen? Oh, I went to Jesus. I fell on my knees. I said, if you're willing. He said, are you kidding me? And he reached out and he touched me. And bam, I was healed. Interestingly enough, Jesus doesn't tell him he can't tell anybody. He does instruct him to go and tell somebody, doesn't he? He says, you need to go and show yourself at church. Show them that you are clean. Do what ceremony requires so that you can be reconnected in the faith community. Evidently, Jesus, having done a work of restoration, was interested in the man's maintenance. To keep him moving forward in faith, the faith that drove him to Jesus in the first place, the faith that gave him the courage to go and throw himself on his knees in front of Jesus and to ask for this blessing. Jesus was interested in that life of faith continuing even past his healing from the physical disease. What Jesus knew was, though he had healed the body, there was a part of him that would need to continue forward in faith to experience ongoing restoration. I suspect that Jesus didn't simply want the physical healing to be the end of the man's spiritual connection with God. Now, it happens to people, doesn't it? You know, when we experience grace and healing, the physical pain, the unexpected diagnosis, the loss of a loved one, the betrayal of a friend, it can drive you to your knees in front of Jesus. And make no mistake about it, he reaches out his hand and he heals those broken, tender places and shares his restoring grace with us. He does. But how easy it is, having experienced healing from sickness, the physical, temporary restoration of feeling better about the circumstance and situation that we're in, that makes us forget the one who healed us. That somehow lets us just begin to walk in the same ways that often led to our brokenness before. I mean, at the end of the day, we just don't perform the spiritual maintenance necessary to maintain those faith connections. So Jesus says to the man, go to the temple, show them that you're clean. Don't tell anybody else, because I'd still like to be able to go into town and encounter everyone else who is in need of this same restoring grace. But I want you connected with the faith community. I want you connected with me. I want you to stay in this relationship, intend it, do the work of ongoing maintenance to remain in love and in dependence on me. Jesus says, I am willing. No question about it. I'm so offended by sin and the brokenness of the world and the impact and effect that it's had on you that I left heaven and I came to earth. I'm going to the cross. I'm rising from the dead, all because I'm willing to heal you, to restore you, to do the deep work of addressing the sin and the brokenness, the heartbreak and the betrayal, the hurt, the pain, the aches, the bruises, the battering, to go all the way back into the very core of who you are and call back into being the one I created at the beginning. I'm willing, Jesus says. Look at the lengths to which I have gone. I am willing. He says, receive my touch. Church, this is the restorative grace of Jesus at work, that when we experience it, we can never be the same again. That leper's life was never the same again. He was immediately reconnected in community, immediately had his connection with the Lord and the community of faith restored by the grace of Jesus. And the incredible difference between what this man experienced and what we experience when we're, rebuilding a fence or repairing a deck or doing any of that is he didn't have to do any of the work. That's what makes it grace. Jesus, if you're willing, make me clean. I am willing, but let me give you a 52-point checklist that you got to go through first. There's none of that in here. Well, I'm willing to restore you by my grace, but first I'm going to need you to do a few things for me. I need you to prove that you're really serious about this. I want to see how badly you really want it. I need to know if you're going to be able to maintain that which I do for you. No. The call to obedience, to discipleship, it, it follows the grace. We did nothing to deserve the coming of Christ into our lives. He just chose it. He just chose it. He just chose it because he loves you, because that's who he is. That's his nature. That's in the very center of his identity is grace. Grace that comes before, unmerited, unsolicited grace that is just pouring out. It's his willingness on display. And having experienced it, this is where the question comes. Will you go now and connect yourself? Will you abide in this relationship, abide in this connection? 5 years ago, I put in a split rail, painted the fence, installed the deck, did all this work. And it was beautiful. And then I ignored it for 5 years. And this week I've suffered the consequence of it. And I'm not done yet. How much more so our souls, friends? Having experienced the amazing grace of Jesus Christ, I know there are many in this room, probably most, who have been touched by Jesus' grace, have felt themselves being restored from the inside out. There are others perhaps who have not experienced that yet. Let me just encourage you, put yourself on your knees before Jesus and just say, are you willing? Because he is. Just put yourself on your knees and say, I'm broken, I'm a mess, and you can have it if you want it. And he says, I do. And I just can promise you, you will experience his touch if you earnestly, courageously put yourself before him and ask. And for those of us who have had that experience, then we tend to that relationship. We remember the joy of our salvation, and we live in it daily. We attend the ordinances of God. We're Methodist after all. We go to band meetings and Sunday school classes and Bible studies. We attend prayer meetings. We attend to our own personal prayer life with the Lord. We don't give up on meeting together, but we regularly gather for the worship of Christ. We remain connected to Christ and to one another in relationships. This is how we do that spiritual maintenance of those who have been restored, who have experienced the touch of Christ in a way that changes us, such that we are never the same again. Make no mistake about it. In his ministry that we read in this Gospel of Mark, we're making our way through this summer, Jesus is freely dispensing his grace to all those. He's casting out demons. He's going to raise the dead. He's healing the sick. He's feeding the hungry. He's quieting the storm. He's answering questions. He's doing all of this stuff. And he's going to do it for so many. He wants to do it for all. Some of the people that he encounters will experience that healing and forget who healed them and walk right back into the life they were living before. And 5 years later, they'll be as broke down or more so as they ever were. And it's not that Jesus, if they present themselves, won't restore them again and again and again and again and again. He's gracious that way. But I'm telling you, you don't have to experience the breakdown, which is no fun. That slow erosion of sin, of disobedience, of participating in the things and ways of the world to the detriment of your faith, that stuff is not fun. It's not beneficial. On my deck, I'm watching as the years go by, as the sun just beats down on us, as the dog's paws scratch up the wood as the paint begins to peel and blister. And I can look at that and I can know that's what happens to my soul when I sever myself in my connection with Jesus. Is my soul just begins to peel and crack and blister, and the claws of others who intend me harm start ripping away. It's no fun. It's no fun. But if we stay connected to the one who restored us, if we maintain that bond of unity and connection with the Lord and his people, then we maintain that restored state in which we live. Jesus didn't die and rise to restore us only so that we can experience failure again and again. He did it so that we could live as free people, as we were created to experience the relationship with him and with one another. That's his restorative grace at work in this testimony and in this room and among us today. I pray, if you are in need of restoration, you would put yourself on your knees before Jesus today. He is willing to reach out and to touch you. And friends, if you have experienced that restoration in your own life, I pray that you remain committed to abiding in him, whose grace changes us in ways that ensure we are never the same again.